Welcome, friends. Today on the show, we are going to talk about the difference between self-rising flour and self-raising flour. Two similar yet different products born out of the same patent in the 1840s. One is a UK-based thing, self-raising. So any of the Commonwealth countries will probably say self-raising, and they mean one thing. And the US South, it's self-rising, and it means something different. So at the core, both of these are flour and baking powder. Now, almost all of the conversions are going to tell you to use all-purpose flour or plain flour, depending on where the recipe was written, and that is fine. So here I have the two variations. The first one I'm going to talk about is self-rising flour, and you're going to see this mostly in US recipes from the American South. And in its most simplified version, it is 1 cup of all-purpose flour, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And you just whisk that together. Now, you can sift it together 2 or 3 times. Whisking is going to get you 99% of the way there. And since you'll probably already have a whisk in your hand, whisking it is just fine. So there we have, at its most basic, the American self-rising flour. This is how we make British, UK, Commonwealth self-raising flour. Again, 1 cup of all-purpose or plain flour and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Same thing, just get in there with a whisk and whisk it together. Now, self-raising flour was invented by a British baker. He patented it in 1845, and he tried to sell this to the British Admiralty, something about giving sailors fresh bread or fresh quick bread on the ships while they were out fighting their wars. He then took out a patent in the United States in the late 1850s, and it just seems to be hit and miss as to whether it is available to you and it is used regularly or not. Where we are, we can buy a self-raising flour in the grocery store, but it only comes in a really small bag. You don't see it too often. Most people don't have it in their pantries. And it just wasn't marketed here. And that really is what it comes down to. In the US South, it was marketed heavily. There were few flour mills that made it regularly, and it really sort of grabbed the hold and stuck on. Part of the impetus for this video is the series that we're doing on Sunday mornings, where we're going back through really old cookbooks. And it sort of brought to the forefront of my brain that there was a time that people who wrote recipes were trained recipe writers. And there was a certain flow to the way that they put things on the page, and they were very careful about how they wrote their recipes for the audience that they were going to reach. Cookbooks were fairly regional, and so if you saw cookbooks that said self-raising flour, it was probably because you could only get self-raising or self-rising. There wasn't a lot of crosstalk, but now with the internet, you're able to look at recipes from all over the globe, and I think it's very important to get consistent results. And in order to get those consistent results, you need to know what the ingredients are, and you have to be very careful when you're looking at what's written in the recipe. The other side of that, of course, is that now you've got a lot of people who aren't trained in writing recipes, and they're going to make mistakes because they might not know that there's a difference between these two products. So if you were expecting to get a really high loft on a cake, and you used this product, self-rising flour, instead, what you're going to get is a lower cake, and it's going to be too salty because this has salt in it, and vice versa. So there's one other thing to talk about with self-rising and self-raising flour. Some brands for both of these don't use all-purpose flour. They use cake and pastry flour, and it has a lower protein content, which makes sense because in most cases you're going to use this in a cake or a scone or a biscuit, and cake flour might be the way to go. So if you really love, the brand in this self-raising is Brody's. It is a cake and pastry flour. If you're using White Lily in the US South, it also is a softer flour, more akin to a cake or pastry flour. So I don't know if I've actually helped you. I may have confused you more than when I started out, but I will leave the relative conversions in the info section below the video. Thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you again soon.